Sing testicles 1, 2, 3, 4. You got the chocolate Nubian in the house. Do you copy? Just getting everything set up over here, ladies and gentlemen. Making sure the wisdomatic truth bombs that I will be disseminating will not be going to waste. Sing testicles 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters around the world, it is your boy, the one and only, your favorite chocolate Nubian soul brother from Ghana, West Africa, Chris Shul, aka the Esoteric Noetic. Be sure to like this video, subscribe, click on the bell, tell your friends, tell your mom, tell your momos, drop us the comments, and let us know what it is. Be sure to smile, take a deep breath, and say, I am on team meh. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk about something of great importance. The Great Reset, the Davos agenda. Sounds like something very sinister, right? Sounds like something out of George Orwell's 1984. But rest assured, or don't rest assured, it is not fiction. It is not built of air and imagination. It is, in fact, a real thing. You may have heard politicians speaking about building back better. You may have heard all of these new policies that are coming into effect in order to ensure that the planet moves towards a more collectivist society where we're all working together as one. So, what is the Great Reset? All right, so ever since this pandemic ensued, we have seen the ruining of many people's lives through COVID, but also through the effects of the lockdowns, the restrictions that have been put in place, right, because of this pandemic. Well, interestingly enough, we've seen this affect the poor, the working class, yours truly, the chocolate Nubian, but the elite, the 1%, apparently they owned about 44% of the wealth in the world before this whole pandemic took place. But we've seen their holdings, their wealth increase by about 25%. And interestingly enough, they're the ones that are advocating for the solution. They're the ones that are talking about how we need to have this great reset to protect the poor, protect all you poor little people out there that have been so negatively impacted. And the solution that they are proposing in order to ensure that we can better address the lives of the ruined and ensure that this pandemic does not come about again, right? Because the whole idea is that, look, we now have to ensure that we have policies in place to prevent this horrible thing that has befallen all of us from ever eventuating. Well, it's interesting that the same people that have influenced the governments in bringing about the coercion, bringing about the lockdowns and restrictions which have led to the ruining of many people's lives are advocating for the solution. And essentially, this is what the Great Reset is about. It's about all of us coming together. I mean, this is the mainstream narrative, to come up with solutions to better handle the planet for pandemics and to put an end to these greedy practices of capitalism. So what is wrong with this? What is wrong with the solutions that are proposed? The problem is that when you take away individual freedoms of people for the greater good in order to bring about a more collectivist society, you usually end up creating more problems, because the people that you're trying to take the freedoms away from by force end up not being happy with this result. Now, granted, we all have these competing ideas of freedom, liberty. One idea is that ultimately freedom is our freedom to work together as one, our freedom to be safe. This is the collectivist ideal of freedom, that fundamentally you cannot have freedom if other people feel unsafe. And if your freedom involves having, possessing property that somewhere down the line may negatively impact others, well, you should be deprived of that freedom. That is the collectivist idea. And then the classical notion of freedom is freedom from aggression. This is the capitalist system that we fundamentally see, not to be confused with crony capitalism, which is a system that allows for counterfeiting, so allows for the Federal Reserve allows for the printing of money, which essentially steals money away from those that have fairly earned it, or crony capitalism that leads to monopolies, or actually advocates for monopolies. So essentially, the government to have a monopoly on violence that allows for all of this activity in the interests of providing a more coherent collectivist system. That's crony capitalism. No, capitalism in its purest form is fundamentally allowing people to trade, do as they will, without government intervention. But what we are seeing in the Great Reset is a rehauling of the classic capitalist system, in order to allow countries, people to feel safe. So this means new legislation that restricts people's ability to move around, that prevents people from being able to use certain technologies because of carbon emissions and so forth. And we see all of these protocols being put in place in order to reduce global warming, in order to protect people from catching viruses and so forth, which eventually leads to a society where we have no freedoms. I mean, one of the slogans of the Great Reset is that you will own nothing and be happy, right? Well, it seems that whereas some people might be happy with that, I, for one, would not. I, for one, as much as I loved the idea of working together as one, to be living in this Star Trek-like environment where we're all working towards the greater good at the cost of what? At depriving people of their lives, of their freedoms? See, this is the problem with this whole notion. And granted, you don't hear the advocates of the Great Reset specifically saying this, that fundamentally they want to take away your freedoms and so forth. When it comes down to the brass tacks, that's actively what they're trying to do. They're trying to create a society where you have to sacrifice more and more of your rights, your property, and so forth. You won't be allowed into establishments unless, of course, you're up to date with your boom shakalaka shots and so forth. And it's this notion that it's all necessary to bring about the greater good. And it's interesting because when we watch these science fiction movies, right, this is the theme that you see time and time again. And we understand this, at least the creators of the science fiction movies understand that this is not a good justification for evil. I mean, this is the theme that you see within the Marvel movies. I recently watched Doctor Strange, and there's this interplay between the philosophy of the greater good versus those that believe in fundamental principles. In fact, you'll hear Doctor Strange often referencing this line that in the grand calculus of the multiverse, your sacrifice is worth more than your life. And this is kind of like paying reference to this ideology that it's acceptable to take away people's lives, take away people's freedoms for the greater good. And in the Doctor Strange 2 movie, spoiler alert, they make reference to this idea about how this is the argument of the tyrants. And this is fundamentally the same argument that you see made by the elite. Granted, they encompass this within the phrase that it's fundamentally working together as one in order to ensure that we can work in harmony for the universe. All of this flowery language, but ultimately what they are advocating for is depriving people of their freedoms. And the one thing that we can all agree on, that we've seen over the last couple of years, hell, it's three years now, right? Is we've slowly had our freedoms taken away from us. Whether it's the Biosecurity Act, whether it's the National Defense Authorization Act, whether it's some state of emergency. I mean, these are the phrases that are always used. They're always enshrouded around these beautiful phrases like we need to have proportionality, which basically means we can compromise your human rights in order to bring about goods. We can restrict your ability to move around. We can make mandates on nations, on individuals, all in order to bring about certain agendas. And don't get me wrong, I think some of the agendas are actually well worth striving to achieve. I like the idea of Star Trek, of us working together to live in harmony with the environment. The problem, though, is that we don't always have the same ideas on what is a severe threat in regards to whether it may be a pandemic or whether it may be global warming, and so forth. And when people use the argument that it's necessary for safety in order to sacrifice freedoms, essentially we're taking away people's human rights to achieve goals that we don't even know are worth fighting for. Because often people get this thing wrong. We've learned over the last few years that many of the claims that were made in regards to what were going on were not built of science. Trust the science, they told us. Well, science is ever changing. The default position of science is to be constantly reevaluating the default position. And if you were basing your goals off of science, you'll find that you were basing this off of things that are not always true. And when you compromise people's freedoms for something that is not true, you find a lot of people are very unhappy. But more importantly, you find that those actions are not based off of sound moral principles. And this is fundamentally what we get within a collectivist system. A lot of people speak about whether or not they believe in a collectivist system or a more capitalist-like system. They speak about how fundamentally you're going to have evil in either of these systems if people are acting, if you have bad actors. And the fundamental distinction is that whereas one system is advocating for what you cannot do, because a lot of people forget that within, let's say, a capitalist system or a system that's based off of common law, there are all of these rules that you cannot violate. They're supposed to be sacrosanct. You can't commit fraud. You can't commit theft. You can't rape. You can't pillage. All of these things are things that you cannot do. It's not to say that we're not going to have greedy people. We're not going to have other problems, but it is the feature of capitalism to not allow the act of violence. However, when you have a collectivist system, because you are always striving for strategies to achieve your ends, you're always willing to compromise things. You can always compromise someone's human rights. You can have lockdowns. It's always a question of how much, which allows you to justify anything and everything in the interest of achieving your goals. So it's always a question of how much can we restrict someone's life, someone's liberty. Let's have this amount of lockdowns. Let's have this amount of taxation. Let's have this amount of forced boom shakalaka mandates. And we will strive to achieve this goal because we got to make the environment better. So essentially, the feature of a collectivist system is that there is no definitive rule in regards to your human rights. And it's always about going back and forth to strive to achieve goals. And this is the problem that you have within this great reset. Granted, they have identified that there is a problem, and we need to restructure if there is a problem, right? Because the problem is that the capitalist system doesn't work. And I would agree with the idea that the capitalist system, in the way in which they are framing it, doesn't work, because when a lot of the advocates of the Great Reset make reference to capitalism, they're speaking about crony capitalism. They're speaking about the current system that allows all of this government intervention that has led to all of these people, all of the poor, being displaced from their jobs. That is a problem. And that is true. It is a problem. But the solution that has been proposed is more of what caused the problem, which is government intervention, which is allowing for organizations, be it the World Health Organization or be it more governmental organizations, to control what individuals can do. And that is the issue with the Great Reset. Build back better. How are we building back better? If all this came about through freedom, I, for one, wouldn't have a problem with it. If all this came about with people deciding, I mean, we could have competing communes, people that want to implement certain things like no boom shakalaka mandates, or people that want to implement carbon restrictions and so forth. And they would do this freely. You could choose which communities you wanted to partake in. You could decide collectively if you agreed, provided it's unanimous, or people have their own resources that they want to govern. I mean, obviously you'd have control over what you do with your own resources, own land, and so forth. But as soon as the government decides to intervene and say, I'm going to force you to implement this within your location, I'm going to force you to give up your property. I mean, we even see at the moment, as part of this Great Reset agenda, ideas proposed that will take away the homes of individuals to provide for those that need those homes, right? Under the idea that there are a lot of refugees and sometimes to the wealthy. And bear in mind, it's not the wealthy that are going to have their homes taken away from them. They're usually the ones that are able to circumvent all of these policies. And it's usually the people that are the poor or the middle class that will have their properties seized in order to provide for the less fortunate. And whereas I think that it's incumbent upon us to actually want to help those less fortunate, but as soon as you start forcing this stuff, this is always the problem. This is the greater good argument that you hear all of these tyrants making in Marvel movies. But for some reason, whereas we see that as being an issue when we're watching these movies, right? When it comes to reality, when it comes to the government, people allow their fear to override their logic, and they start advocating for this greater good rationale. And look, granted, I realize that a lot of the people that are doing this, a lot of the proponents of the Great Reset, I actually believe are concerned about the welfare of humanity. I don't believe, in fact, I know that this doesn't apply, bearing in mind that I'm not speaking in definitives here. Anytime you're saying that every single person believes this if they are part of this organization, well, you're inclined to be generalizing. And look, there are definitely some dark, sinister figures that are involved in the Great Reset, but I think a lot of the what we call elite, the rich, the wealthy, truly do feel guilty that they benefited so much from what's happened and want to think of ways to arrive at a solution to the problem. Or sometimes they are acting out of fear. They know that some of the policies they are implementing are not in line with human rights, but because they're more concerned about their family, more concerned about other people, right? They want to implement these gross violations of people's freedoms, like these boom shakalaka mandates and so forth. A lot of the times, people think they are acting out of love, but where is the motivation is love, because you want to protect people that you care about. I mean, what mother would not sacrifice the life of everyone around her to protect her young, right? But it's not the motivation that is impure per se. It's the action in of itself. If I want to save the lives of my friends and my family, therefore I go and steal something from someone, or I take, or I force people to undergo experimental boom shakalakas in the interests of protecting people I care about, knowing full well that they are experimental, then obviously I become the bad guy. Unless, of course, you subscribe to the moral view that if your action, if the result serves a purpose, it's acceptable. But the result is irrelevant. You committed something that you shouldn't have committed in order to bring about a scenario that may not even eventuate. I mean, I love the sci-fi series. I mean, this is based off of well, I'm talking about Halo here. It's based off of a book. And there's this figure in Halo known as Halsey, and her entire ideology is so interesting and so despicable because she has this mindset that she's willing to, that it's acceptable to kidnap children and essentially rape them, right? Force them to undergo very dangerous procedures, right? In the interest that she can see the future, and it's to protect the human race from an alien group of people called the Covenant that may very well destroy the human race unless, of course, they have a line of defense, which are the Spartans. And it's granted in the series we see that Halsey has some very dark, sinister ideas, but we kind of justify it. We say, well, she's got good intentions, but ultimately you realize that this kind of stuff is dangerous in the real world because, I mean, it's dangerous, period. I mean, it's wrong, period. Obviously, you're killing innocent people, you're raping innocent people to bring about a goal, but it often doesn't lead to the projected outcome. I mean, what happens if we find out some years later that the goals that were trying to be achieved by the Great Reset, the Davos agenda, have actually resulted in creating more problems? Do we say, well, their notions were valid? And look, I understand that a lot of people don't even see the very act of violating people's rights as inherently wrong. A lot of people have we have these competing ideas of liberty and human rights, whereas there are some people that think that you have a right to be safe, therefore it's all right to force people to undergo medical boom shakalakas and force people to stay in their homes and so forth, because their idea is that, well, you're constantly balancing this safety with or goals with actual rights, right? But the reality is that that perspective is flawed because it's morally relativistic, and it requires people to have an understanding in regards to at least some basic understanding of a moral philosophy, I guess, in order to arrive at the right conclusions. And the problem is, a lot of people don't, but more importantly, a lot of people do not care. They care more about their fears than they do about doing what they know to be right within the moment. As Master Yoda would often say,
You should be mindful of the past and the future, but not at the cost of the present.
you should be mindful of the past and the future, but not at the cost of the present. That means do not compromise your principles, your values. That means intrinsic values, things that, and these are universal qualities that we find within human rights, within the common law. Don't hit, don't take shit that's not yours. Don't commit violence, fraud. Honor your commitments, this kind of stuff, basic stuff. But if you're willing to compromise that, all because you're trying to build back better, well, don't be surprised if you find yourself in some dystopian future where you are all being forced to undergo experimental boom shakalakas, are restricted in regards to what you can say, even what you can think. We all have these neural link devices that have been implanted on us. And we now have says, and those that are dissenters, well, they get thrown into concentration camps. This is another thing that we saw, right? And it's interesting, whereas all of this stuff used to be within the realm of conspiracy theory. I mean, there is a website. It's called The Great Reset. I mean, it's right there for you to see. There are conferences that take place. The World Economic Forum, the Davos agenda. This is something that is very much a real thing. So much that our politicians speak about this openly. And they come up with slogans like, you will own nothing and be happy. Now, granted, they've had to backstep because a lot of people have exposed this, and you'll find that you can't find a lot of this stuff. But because of the way back machine, like this thing that allows you to have a look at websites and see what was on them previously, we know that this stuff very much is a thing. And these people very much are trying to essentially take away your property rights, create a system where we are controlled. It's basically a centralized system. And if there's one thing nature abhors, it's centralization. I mean, there is this synchronicity, this beauty in regards to how everything in nature, and when I say nature, I'm making reference to that which is of the earth, that has not been perverted through, I guess, the human technology. I mean, you can make the argument that humans are a part of technology, a part of nature as well, and the technologies we come up with are still natural. But if we take things further back in the most to the most basic level, you find that nature often works in a state of harmony. And as we try to control things, bring about this centralization, whether it's by controlling how our body works through manipulating with certain pharmaceuticals and so forth, or manipulating humans through these governmental systems, controlling what they can do, what they can say, the more problems we create within nature. That's why, as much as I have my own views in regards to what we should achieve, like if I was a 1%er, I'd be thinking, man, maybe it'd be great to create this society where we have all of these checks and balances in place where people can be governed. But the thing is, I would know that I can't force that on people. I can't play God. As wisdomatic as you are, the greatest wisdom is to know that you cannot force wisdom upon others. You can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Boom, shakalaka. See, that's why you listen to Chocolate Nubian, right? Now, everyone's heard that one. But I would say definitely that part of wisdom is not only to be aware of things, but it's how you act. To act in accordance with wisdom. To know and not to do is not to know. And you can't truly be a wisdomatic chocolate Nubian soul brother if you're a hypocrite, if you believe in freedom but you're so willing to fight for things that violate your principles, your freedom, despite how good your... There is no idea that is so good, so no charity that is so worth forcing people to be charitable over. Ladies and gentlemen, freaks and geeks, brothers and sisters around the world, I'm going to leave it there. Remember, there are three things that cannot remain hidden for long: the sun, the moon, and all the pretty ladies that are going to be sliding into my DMs with their appraisals for all my wisdomatic truth bombs. Now, the wisdomatic truth bombs of the chocolate Nubian soul brother. Until next time, Surya Namaskar, Namaste. Peace in the Middle East. Be sure to check us out. I got some links. You can find all my links under chrisshul.com. I'm going to be doing some live podcasts very soon. I'm going to be talking about a whole range of topics, not just keeping it to the conspiracy theories, but talking about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Got some very interesting guests coming along. So stay tuned. Check us out on the Spotify. I got my music up there, and I also got these podcasts. I'm on iTunes, Spotify. I'm everywhere. The Chocolate Nubian is taking over the interwebs. Until next time, signing out, Chris Shul. Ow!